I came home from a business trip and my driveway was gone. Not blocked, not under construction, just gone like it had never existed, buried under fresh concrete like someone decided my life was an inconvenience they could just pave over. And the worst part is, they thought they had every right to do it. I remember sitting there in my truck, engine still running, staring at that smooth gray slab where my gravel used to be, thinking maybe I had pulled into the wrong house. But no, there was my porch, same old creaky step, same wind chime my dad hung 20 years ago. Except now I had no way to reach it without driving across my own lawn like some kind of trespasser on my own land. And right there, zip-tied to my mailbox, was a laminated notice that said Community Improvement in Progress. Please expect temporary inconvenience. Like that somehow made it okay. Like erasing a man's driveway was the same as repainting a fence. I just sat there for a minute, hands on the wheel, feeling that slow burn crawl up my chest, the kind that doesn't explode right away but settles in deep. Because that driveway wasn't just gravel and dirt. It was something my father and grandfather had laid down together. Back when I was maybe 10 years old, I still remember the way my dad let me press my initials into the wet cement along the edge, said something like, "This is yours one day, take care of it." And now it was gone under a sidewalk some HOA decided looked nicer in their little brochure version of the neighborhood. Now, to understand how this even happened, you gotta know a little about where I live. My place sits just outside a development called Brook Hollow Estates. Neat rows of identical houses, trimmed hedges, flags out front, the kind of place where people complain if your trash can is visible from the street for more than a few hours. And then there's my house. Older, a little rough around the edges, sitting on land that's been in my family since before any of those houses existed. We never joined their HOA, never signed anything, never paid their fees, and for years that rubbed some of them the wrong way. I'd get looks, the occasional passive-aggressive note about property values, but nothing I couldn't ignore, until apparently, they decided ignoring me wasn't enough. I grabbed the notice, read it again just to make sure I wasn't missing something, then I called the number listed at the bottom. It rang twice before a woman picked up, voice smooth and polite in that way that somehow makes it worse. "Brook Hollow HOA. This is Denise speaking. How can I help you?" I said, "Yeah, you can start by explaining why my driveway's under concrete." There was a pause, not long, just enough to tell me she already knew exactly who I was. "Oh, you must be the homeowner at 87 Carter Lane," she said, almost like she'd been expecting the call. "We've had ongoing complaints about that gravel entrance. It didn't meet community standards, so the board approved an extension of the sidewalk for aesthetic continuity." I actually laughed at that, just a short, disbelieving sound. "You approved it without talking to me?" Another pause, then she said it, calm as anything. "That section is now considered part of the community access pathway." That word, community, they love that word, makes everything sound justified, like if enough people agree on something, it stops being wrong. I leaned against my truck, staring at the concrete again, and said, "That's my property." And she replied, almost sweetly, "Sir, Brook Hollow maintains shared access standards for the neighborhood," which is a fancy way of saying they decided my land belonged to them now. I didn't yell, didn't threaten, I just said, "All right, we'll see about that," and hung up before she could give me another rehearsed line. Because at that point, I knew two things. One, they'd crossed a line, and two, they were counting on me not knowing exactly where that line was. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying everything in my head, the driveway, my dad's voice, that stupid laminated notice, and underneath all of it was this quiet question. How did they think they could get away with this? Because people like that don't just act, they calculate, they assume they're safe, that they've got the rules on their side, or at least enough gray area to push through without consequences. And that got me thinking about something my grandfather used to say, usually when dealing with county paperwork or property lines. Land remembers things people forget. So the next morning, I drove down to the county records office, the same building I'd been to a handful of times growing up, dusty files, old maps, clerks who've seen everything and nothing surprises them anymore. I walked in, gave them my parcel number, and asked to see everything tied to my property, not just the current deed, but anything historical, easements, transfers, anything that might explain how a sidewalk suddenly replaced my driveway overnight. The woman behind the counter, older, glasses hanging low on her nose, looked at me for a second and said, "You'd be surprised how often people come in here after something's already gone wrong." Then she disappeared into the back and came out with a stack of documents thick enough to tell me there was more to this story than I'd been told. I spent the next couple hours going through maps, old filings, faded signatures, and that's when I saw it, a narrow strip of land running along the main road into Brook Hollow, labeled as a private access easement. Not public, not HOA owned, private, and the name attached to it wasn't mine, not directly. It was a company, one I hadn't thought about in years. And the second I read that name, I felt something shift, because I knew exactly where it came from. The name on that document hit me like a memory I didn't know I still had. Carter Holdings, LLC. It wasn't something we talked about much growing up, just one of those quiet, practical things my grandfather set up back in the 80s when the county decided to reroute the main road and carve a new entrance through what used to be farmland. I remember overhearing him once at the kitchen table, telling my dad, "Never let them take control of access. Whoever controls the road controls everything." And at the time it sounded like one of those old man sayings you nod at without really understanding. But standing there in that records office, staring at that faded ink, I finally got it. I asked the clerk if the company was still active. She typed for a bit, squinted at the screen, then said, "Technically, yes. It's dormant, but it hasn't been dissolved." I felt my pulse pick up just a little. "And ownership?" She clicked again, then looked up at me. "Transferred to next of kin, looks like you." For a second, I didn't say anything. I just nodded, like I already knew. Even though I didn't, not fully. But it made sense. My grandfather passed. Everything moved to my dad. Then to me. Except no one ever brought this part up, probably because it never mattered until now. I spent the rest of that day digging deeper, pulling every document tied to that easement. Maps showing exactly where it ran, legal descriptions, usage rights. And the more I read, the clearer it became. The road leading into Brook Hollow, the one every single resident used to get in and out, wasn't actually theirs. It just crossed land they assumed was public because no one ever challenged it. But legally, it belonged to that company, to me. Now here's the thing. I'm not the kind of guy who goes looking for fights. I keep to myself, fix what needs fixing, pay my taxes, mind my business. But there's a difference between avoiding conflict and letting someone walk all over you. And what they did to my driveway, that wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a decision. They decided my property didn't matter because I wasn't part of their little system. And suddenly, I had something they hadn't accounted for. The next week was quiet, intentionally quiet. I didn't call the HOA back, didn't argue, didn't make a scene. I filed paperwork, transferred the easement out of Carter Holdings and into my name, paid off the back taxes, which honestly were almost laughable. Under $300 for something that controlled access to an entire neighborhood, and every step of the way, I kept thinking about how confident Denise sounded on the phone, how certain they were that they had the authority. Confidence like that usually means one thing: they never checked. By Thursday, everything cleared, clean, legal, undeniable. I held the updated deed in my hand sitting at my kitchen table, same table my grandfather used to spread his maps across, and I'll admit, I sat there for a while just looking at it, turning it over like it might say something different if I read it again, but it didn't. It said exactly what I needed it to say. That's when the idea stopped being a thought and became a plan. I called a contractor I'd worked with before, a guy named Luis, solid crew, no questions asked as long as the paperwork checks out. I told him I needed a gate installed at the entrance to a private road, heavy duty, double wide, something that made a statement. He came out that afternoon, looked over the site, nodded once, and said, "You trying to keep people out or make a point?" I said both. He smiled a little at that, like he'd heard something similar before, then said, "Give me 48 hours. We started Friday evening, right after rush hour. Timing mattered. I didn't want a scene while it was going up. I wanted them to wake up to it. There's something about surprise that hits harder than confrontation. The post went in first, steel sunk deep. Then the gate itself, black, solid, no way around it without making it very obvious. And finally the sign. Private road, access by permission only. Simple, clean, impossible to misunderstand. I went to bed that night knowing exactly what was coming. And for the first time since I got back from that trip, I slept just fine. Saturday morning, I made coffee, stepped out onto my porch, and just listened. At first it was quiet. Then slowly, It started, engines idling, car doors slamming, voices rising. By the time I walked down toward the road, there was already a line of cars backed up past the entrance, people standing around in pajamas, gym clothes, some still holding their morning coffee like they couldn't quite process what they were seeing. And right there at the front, pacing back and forth like a man trying to hold on to control that was slipping fast, was a guy I recognized. Martin Hale, HOA president, mid-50s, always dressed like he had somewhere important to be, even when he didn't. He spotted me walking up and his expression shifted from confusion to something sharper, something more personal. "What the hell is this?" he snapped, gesturing at the gate like it had personally offended him. I didn't rush, didn't raise my voice. I just walked up, hands in my pockets, and said, "Morning, Martin." "Don't morning me," he shot back. "You can't block this road. People need to get through." I tilted my head a little, glanced at the line of cars, then back at him. "Seems like they don't." That didn't land well. You could feel the tension tighten, like a wire being pulled too far. "This is a community access road," he said, slower now, like explaining something obvious to someone who just wasn't getting it. "You don't have the authority to shut it down." And that's when I pulled the folded document from my back pocket, held it out just enough for him to see the header, the seal. "Actually, I do." He didn't take it at first, just stared at it, then at me, like he was trying to decide if this was some kind of bluff. Finally, he grabbed it, eyes scanning fast, then slowing, then stopping altogether. And in that moment, you could see it, the shift, the realization that whatever control he thought he had wasn't there anymore. This isn't right," he said, but it came out quieter now. "No," I agreed. "What you did to my driveway, that wasn't right." People were starting to gather closer, whispering, trying to piece things together. Someone asked what was going on. Someone else said something about calling the police, and Martin, still holding that paper, looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, not as the outsider at the edge of the neighborhood, but as a problem he didn't know how to solve. "You need to open this gate," he said, but there wasn't much force behind it anymore. I shook my head. "You poured concrete over my property without permission. Until that's fixed, this road stays closed." And just like that, the balance shifted. It didn't take long for things to escalate after that. Someone did call the police, not in a calm, "let's sort this out" kind of way, but in that frantic tone people use when the rules they rely on suddenly stop working. I leaned against the side of the gate while we waited, arms crossed, watching the crowd grow thicker, voices overlapping, frustration turning into something louder, messier, and through it all, Martin just stood there, gripping that deed like it might change if he stared at it long enough. When the patrol car finally pulled up, everything quieted down just a little, not silence, but that tense kind of hush where everyone's waiting to see which way things are about to go. Two officers stepped out, one older, one younger, both with that same look I'd seen 100 times before, not interested in drama, just facts. "What seems to be the issue here?" the older one asked, glancing between me and Martin. Martin stepped forward first. Of course he did. "He's blocking access to a residential community," he said, voice tight, trying to sound controlled. "This road is used by over 40 households. He can't just shut it down." The officer nodded, then looked at me. "That true?" I shrugged a little. "Road's private property." I closed it. "Private?" the younger officer repeated. I handed over the paperwork, same way I had with Martin. No rush, no theatrics. Just the truth, printed and sealed. They took their time reading it, flipping pages, checking details, and while they did, I could feel every set of eyes on me, waiting for something to crack, but nothing did. After a minute, the older officer handed the papers back and turned to Martin. "He's right. This is a privately owned access easement. If he wants to restrict entry, that's within his legal rights." You could almost hear the air get sucked out of the crowd. A few people started talking at once. Confusion, disbelief, a couple of angry voices rising above the rest, but the officer just held up a hand. "If you believe there's been a violation, that's a civil matter. You'll need to take it up in court." Court, that word landed heavy, because everyone there knew what it meant: time, money, uncertainty. And for the first time since I got back, I saw something different in Martin's face, not authority, not irritation, concern. The officers left not long after that, nothing more to do. And just like that, the situation wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. The gate stayed closed. By that evening, I got the call. Not Denise this time. No, this was a different tone entirely. "This is Richard Cole, legal counsel for Brook Hollow Estates." The voice said, clipped, professional, the kind of voice that doesn't waste words. "I'd like to discuss a resolution." I leaned back in my chair, phone pressed to my ear, looking out at that same stretch of concrete that used to be my driveway. "I'm listening." "We believe there's been a misunderstanding regarding property boundaries and usage rights," he said. I smiled a little at that. Misunderstanding. Funny how that word shows up when leverage changes hands. "Is that what you call pouring concrete over someone else's land without permission?" A pause, not long, but enough. "We're prepared to address that issue." "Good," I said, "because right now, nobody gets through that gate." He exhaled slowly, like he was adjusting his approach. "What would it take to resolve this?" And that's where things got simple. Not easy, not small, but simple. "First," I said, "you remove every inch of that sidewalk from my property and restore my driveway exactly how it was, gravel, grade, everything. Second, you compensate me for the damage and the time. Third," I paused, just long enough to let it settle, "if you want continued access to that road, we establish a usage agreement. Annual fee. Maintenance covered." Another pause, longer this time. "That's a significant request," he said carefully. "No," I replied. "What's significant is you thought you could take something that wasn't yours and face no consequences." We went back and forth for a bit after that. Numbers, terms, the usual dance, but the truth is, they didn't have much room to negotiate. That road wasn't optional. It was the only way in or out. Every day it stayed closed, pressure built, people missing work, deliveries delayed, routines disrupted, and all of it traced back to one decision they made without thinking it through. By Monday morning, the tone had shifted completely. Richard called again, this time without the edge. "We're prepared to move forward with your terms." Of course they were. Within the week, crews were back out in front of my house. Different ones this time. Quieter, more careful, cutting into that same concrete they'd poured like it belonged to them, hauling it away piece by piece, and I stood there watching, not with anger anymore, but with something closer to balance, like a scale finally settling where it should have been all along. They rebuilt the driveway properly, gravel laid clean, edges defined, even matched the slight curve my dad had insisted on all those years ago. I noticed that small detail, but it mattered. The compensation came through not long after, wired, no argument, and the agreement. Well, that was the part that stuck. $7,500 a year for access. We put it in writing, signed, notarized, clean, and binding. Every resident now had access through that gate, but not freely. They each got a remote, registered, controlled, and the gate stayed. That first morning it operated under the new system. I stood on my porch again, coffee in hand, listening, same as before. Engines, tires on pavement, but different this time, slower, more deliberate, a pause at the gate, a click, then it opened, one car at a time. And I won't lie, there was a certain quiet satisfaction in that. Not because I wanted to make their lives harder, but because for once, the boundary was clear, respect wasn't optional anymore. Now, I've had people ask me since then, neighbors from outside the development, even a couple folks from inside who eventually came around. They ask if I went too far, if maybe I should have just taken the high road, let it go, avoided all the tension. And I get that. I do. But here's the thing. There's a difference between peace and permission. If I had let that slide, if I had accepted that temporary inconvenience as just part of living near them, what happens next time? What else becomes community property because it's easier for them? Sometimes, standing your ground isn't about winning. It's about making sure the line stays where it belongs. So yeah, the gate's still there. The road's still mine. And every time it opens, it reminds everyone involved how this all started. Now I'm curious, what would you have done in my place? Would you have fought it the same way or handled it differently? Let me know in the comments, because I've heard arguments on both sides, and honestly, it's one of those situations where the line between right and wrong depends a lot on where you're standing.